Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore and the War for Armageddon. Today we will be starting to look at the First War, and just in case somebody will mention it, there was no demon invasion of Armageddon, and if you keep talking about that, the Inquisition is going to have to come to your house. So, before we begin, a quick clarification. The Battle for Armageddon is one of those events that was first described in the very, very old lore, 2nd edition in fact. Much of that information is currently contested by the newer sources, books and Black Library novels, who also contradict themselves and the old lore quite frequently. I will primarily be using the new source books, but I will occasionally use parts of the old lore and some of the books, where I feel it sounds appropriate and makes sense. Additionally, the time of sieges and battles will in many cases be conjecture, as it is not accurately recorded. Well then, shall we begin? The first invasion of Armageddon officially began in 941 Millennia 41, with the registration of the space hulk Alveus Alpha Alpha Sextus. It should be noted, however, that this is the official date stated as the start of the incursion in Imperial records. At the time of the Hulk's identification, the people of Armageddon still had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them from a quite literally blue sky, or in the case of Armageddon, poisonous yellow. The administration of Armageddon's current ruler, the Overlord von Straub, had designated the Space Hulk as a lifeless derelict, and had in fact already started handing out survey and recovery rights to local firms, and of course, the Adeptus Mechanicus. However, nobody had actually bothered to check if the Space Hulk was actually lifeless or not. The first person on Armageddon to notice that something was wrong was the now famous Commissar Henrik. Henrik had had a long and illustrious career in the Imperial Guard as, well, a commissar, and had been sent to Armageddon to live out his retirement, although he could not quite retire and had gotten on the local governor's nerve on multiple occasions. Henrik established that the space hulk could in fact not be uninhabited due to the undeniable fact that it had already disgorged massive numbers of orcs onto every single planet it had passed so far. And if that was not enough evidence of an orc infestation, then the swarms of orc ships that had issued forth from the Hulk and destroyed Armageddon's local space defense fleet should be considered fairly compelling evidence. Now, you could certainly ask yourself how it is even possible for System Command to miss this in the first place. But at this point, the question of blame was rendered entirely irrelevant by the simple fact that the Ork Hulk World Killer was on a direct collision course with the planet Armageddon. When Commissar Henrik's desperate plea for help was finally transmitted, the Hulk was mere hours away from impact, and additionally, the plea for help was transmitted against the Overlord's express wishes, an act that the Commissar was sternly reprimanded for and would under normal circumstances cost him his position, but at this point there was simply no denying the presence of the Ork invader. Advanced elements of the invasion force had already begun landing across Armageddon, and in Henrik's own estimate, the Orks were expected to begin landing troops from the Hulk within mere hours. This would turn out to be a somewhat optimistic estimate because the Orks had no plans of unloading troops from the rock onto the planet. They had a plan of unloading the rock directly onto the planet. It was blindingly obvious that someone had fucked up monstrously, but there would be a time for recrimination later. For the moment, simple survival was the order of the day. What happened next should be rather obvious. The defenders of Armageddon had virtually no time to prepare, as practically any and all efforts to do so and to mobilize the PDF and the Steel Legion had been countermanded by von Straub. Not only did they not have the time to prepare, but the various PDF, militia, and Steel Legion forces were wildly scattered in peacetime deployment. They were deployed to counter the threat of hive gangers, bandits, and minor cases of civil unrest, not a massed invasion of a well-equipped and extremely mobile orc horde. As for the planetary defense fleet, it had been sent to meet the Space Hulk and ordered to take no offensive actions, because after all, it was unoccupied. When that very same understrength and fairly small defense flotilla was attacked by waves upon waves of Ork ships, well, their fate was rather self-explanatory. And while Armageddon was relatively well equipped with orbital defense weapons in the form of massive missile silos and las batteries, there was nowhere near enough of them to stop a Space Hulk. And even if there were, the orbital defenses were not ordered to fire upon the Space Hulk until it was far, far too late. In a last desperate effort, the orbital defense batteries shaved huge chunks off the Space Hulk as it entered into the planet's atmosphere, killing tens if not hundreds of thousands of Orks, and the rather crude arrival of the Space Hulk undoubtedly killed thousands more, but in the end it was but the merest drop in the ocean, as millions of Orks began to stream from the crashed World Killer. To their credit, the various military commanders on Armageddon responded quickly to the unfolding catastrophe. Many of them followed the instructions issued by Commissar Henrik rather than the overlord Hermann von Straub. Those who followed von Straub's orders, well, they were less successful in their endeavors. Nevertheless, with no hope of organizing effective resistance in the field, the Imperial forces began a large-scale withdrawal to the planet's fortified hive cities. These retreating Imperial forces inevitably attracted large numbers of refugees as the civilian population sought to flee from the Ork hordes and reach the quote-unquote safety of the hives. The refugees were getting in the way of the military convoys, and further slowing down the creation of any meaningful military force. Naturally, the military decision would be for the PDF and Guard forces to simply run down anything in their path and hasten to form up either around the hives or for a large-scale counterattack. But, at the end of the day, even if such an order was issued, it is unlikely it would have resulted in anything but further disgust for High Command, as several local officers made efforts to shield the refugees from the Orks, and several regiments of Guard and PDF troops were unfortunately annihilated as they made desperate last stands to buy the civilian population time to escape. An example of this was Lieutenant Hexel of the Steel Legion. His regiment, along with several other formations, including stragglers from other regiments, and 2 regiments of Ash Waste militia, managed to slow down a massive Ork horde heading for the Hive Volcanus, following a refugee column. The refugees had trodden down an area of chemical desert to the north of his position. This provided the only relatively stable land for many, many miles in any direction. To the south was massive ash waste plains, and to the north was the chemical desert in proper. Not even the Orks can cross that shifting wasteland of chemical waste without severely damaging both the Horde, its vehicles, and quite possibly shattering the entire endeavor. As such, Lieutenant Hexel requested mines to be flown to his position. Von Straub did not respond, but Commissar Henrik sent 2 shuttle loads of mines from Hades, much depleting his own reserves. The lieutenant then proceeded to seed the path that had been trodden down by the refugees with a 2-kilometer square minefield, to prevent the Orks from taking the easy road. If they wanted to avoid the minefield, they would have to cut through the south, into the ash wastes, which the lieutenant had also undermined and placed vast quantities of explosives under the unstable ground. Once the Ork horde had been lured into the trap, the explosives were detonated, dumping the Orks down into massive chasms filled with ash wastes and other chemical pollutants. This, along with the stubborn defense of his Steel Legion regiments and the Ash Waste militia, bought the refugees much-needed time to escape, and also slowed down the Horde's march against Hive Volcanus. Unfortunately, the lieutenant, along with his regiment and all other forces present, were wiped out to the last man, trying to hold back the overwhelming numbers of the Ork horde. Meanwhile, Armageddon High Command had their arms full. The only meaningful command structure in place on Armageddon at the time was organized by Commissar Yarrick, who had been exiled to Hades' Hive. This had, quite luckily, gotten him out of the way of the main Ork invasion. The Overlord and his administration refused to accept the reality of the invasion for several days. They seemed convinced that even if the Ork forces were real, they numbered only a few thousand at the most, and kept issuing strident orders for individual units to stop fleeing and counterattack. Though, when I say issuing orders, I mean the Overlord made various ranting Vox broadcasts, condemning the cowardice of the PDF and Guard commanders, and urging them to restore their honor by turning around and routing the bestial foe. These utterly ridiculous demands were ignored by many Imperial commanders who now took their instructions from Hades' Hive. Although at this point the Overlord was still the de facto ruler of Armageddon, and as such most of the officers either flat out ignored any radio broadcasts received, a dangerous proposition in the Guard, or pretended to be having Vox problems, atmospheric interference, and that kind of stuff. For many, however, the previous option was impossible due to the presence of attached commissars, and the latter equally impractical, as they had yet to be engaged by the Orks, and so claiming mechanical problems or other issues would be less than entirely convincing. Those Imperial commanders who either could not or would not ignore these instructions were almost all wiped out, along with their regiments. And there is not even a shadow of a doubt about the fact that these stand-and-fight orders cost the defenders of Armageddon dearly. Some estimates go so high as to suggest that 1/3 of Armageddon's total defense forces were either shattered irrevocably or utterly annihilated due to poor command and control. It also did not help that this was not just a mere Ork horde. The horde was under command of Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, and although it was early days yet in his illustrious career, he had already picked up quite the flair for rapid movements. His horde was also equipped with vast numbers of bikes and truck transports, meaning that any hesitation on behalf of the Imperial Guard forces was almost guaranteed to be severely punished by the Orks. And the Orks wasted no time in taking advantage of the strategic situation. On Armageddon Prime, the various commanders were being dragged here, there, and nowhere by the various decrees from their Overlord and by the Old Man of Armageddon, Commissar Yarrick, many of which had chosen to stay loyal to their oaths rather than to what would be sensible. Many Imperial Guard Steel Legion regiments, along with Ash Waste militia and PDF troops, had been destroyed before reaching the Hive cities. Those who did reach the Hive cities often reached them in disarray, and this of course had one further strategic effect. At this point in time, the continent of Armageddon Prime, with the exception of the fortified Hive cities, was entirely under the Orks' control, which meant that the defensive forces guarding Armageddon Secundus, and more specifically the Equatorial Jungle, had absolutely no warning nor information on what to expect beyond rumors and very, very sketchy intelligence reports, most of which had been garnered by high-flying aircraft. It was enough to give a general indication of where the Ork hordes might enter the Equatorial Jungle, but once beneath that green canopy, even the massive Ork hordes movements would be essentially impossible to find. To make matters worse, the Overlord's orders had also reached Secundus, where we get to see an example of one of these stand-and-fight orders inflicting significant damage upon Armageddon's defenders. Captain Crone's forces had been ordered to stop any Ork forces trying to make their way through the jungle between Prime and Secundus. The only problem was that there wasn't anywhere near enough defenders to actually defend the entirety of the border between Prime and Secundus. With this in mind, Captain Corone and the various other commanders who had decided to stand and fight according to the Overlord's orders, at the very least fortified the areas that would be most easily defendable. There is one vast area where the jungle opens up onto Secundus with no obstacles. However, the Orks were not aware of this. They had not exactly been carrying out complicated and long-term scouting missions before ramming their Ork rock directly into the planet's surface. The hope then was that they would appear either to the south or the north of this weak spot. The most direct route was to the north, and so this is where the majority of the PDF and Imperial Guard regiments gather, and as luck would have it, this was also where the Orks would appear. They appeared on the other side of the Diabolus River, opposite one of the main concentration of Steel Legion forces. So far, so good, but this was also where the Imperial Defenders' luck was about to run out. The Overlord Hermann von Straub had assured the various commanders that at worst he expected them to deal with nothing more than a few lucky green-skinned savages that had managed to make it through the jungles. He had even suggested that they might take this opportunity to get in a little bit of target practice. What appeared out of the jungle, however, was far from a few hundred lucky savages. Hundreds of thousands of Orks broke out of the jungle tree line and stormed across the Diabolus River, straight into the face of fortified defensive positions. The Armageddon Steel Legion inflicted horrifying casualties on the Orks as they waded through the red waters of the chemically polluted Diabolus River. However, there were far too many Orks and nowhere near enough Imperial Guard. The commanders sent out desperate pleas for reinforcements. However, the Overlord Hermann von Straub had none to give them. After all, they were dealing with a few savages at most. As for Commissar Yarrick, he was adamant that any Imperial forces that were following his orders were to continue to consolidate. He saw it as far more important to create a credible fighting force, and also, if that was not possible, defend the hives, rather than simply sending out reinforcements to every single leak in the dam. And at this point, there was a damn many leaks springing up everywhere. And while this decision was undoubtedly strategically sound, it was little solace for the Imperial Guardsmen dying in their thousands on the Diabolus River. Miraculously, a relatively large force managed to disentangle themselves from the Ork invaders and pull back towards the mountain range. Unfortunately, this was where much of this force was surrounded by Ork speed freaks and pinned up against the mountains. Only a relatively small formation was able to make their way across the mountain range and down onto the plains beyond. The defensive force had suffered massive casualties. The majority of the force had been annihilated either at the river or while trapped against the mountains. But the folly of the Overlord did not end there, with the destruction of the Armageddon Steel Legion forces trapped against the mountain ranges past the Diabolus River. The Titan formation Legio Metallica, under the command of Princeps Kurt Mannerheim, had been ordered in to stem the flow of the Orks. The Overlord ordered the Legio and its Skitarii forces to join with the Armageddon 1st Armored Tank Division and destroy the invader, the few lucky greenskins that had made it through the jungle. The Overlord did not expect the Princeps to deal with anything larger than a minor skirmish, again suggesting that they might look at it as a chance to get in some target practice. Mannerheim himself protested the order fiercely, and could have potentially refused the order, since the Legio Metallica was of course a Mechanicus unit, not an Imperial Guard formation. But the Princep had taken an oath to defend Armageddon and to obey its ruler. And so he said goodbye to his wife and his children, put on his best dress uniform, and led his Titan Steel Hammer, along with an unknown number of his legion, presumably 3 to 5 other Titans, along with the Skitarii and Armageddon tank forces, into the heart of the Ork advance. All Titan and ground forces who partook in the offensive were wiped out to the last man and the last vehicle. The Titan Steel Hammer strode straight into the midst of the Ork horde before deliberately overloading its reactor. The resulting explosion tore the heart from the Ork horde, and it was so fierce that members of the Armageddon 8th and 3rd Steel Legion that had been fighting 50 kilometers to the south experienced several hundred cases of blindness and flesh burns. These formations, known as the Armageddon 8th and the 3rd, had been carrying out a fighting withdrawal for the last 3 weeks at this point, and now consisted of 4 regiments and 3 brigades at 75% strength, along with several scratch companies constructed from 5 other regiments. A battalion of Rough Riders were also attached to the formation, although they had used to be a battalion. At this point, they were reduced to a single company. The formation's only fresh troops were the Armageddon 10th, who had arrived too late to partake in the defense of the river Stygius to the south of the main engagement zone, but just in time to take up rearguard positions and defend the much battered host as it withdrew. Unfortunately for it, large formations of Ork speed freaks had broken through several areas of their defensive lines along the river Stygius to the north and to the south. The Imperial forces to the north, along the River Diabolus, were now cut off entirely from the southern defensive forces, while the forces in the south were cut off from any other Imperial formations, and were pushed north towards the River Diabolus defenders, and were, just like them, trapped against the Palladius mountain range. Yet another victim of von Straub's hold at all cost order. After a little under 2 months. 2 months that included both the defences of the rivers Stygius and Diabolus themselves, followed by the retreat from these defensive positions when the Ork hordes grew too massive, and then finally the hopeless last stand as the forces were trapped against the Palladius mountain ranges. All there was left to do now was the butcher's tally. The precise numbers of the casualties are unclear, as most things are during these chaotic days of the Ork invasion. What we do know is that a substantial portion of the Legio Metallica's Titan forces stationed on Armageddon was wiped out, leaving the formation's strength on Armageddon as little more than a token force. After the war, the Titan Legion would be rebuilt with reinforcements from the Legio at large, but at this point in time, no further mentions are made of the Legio Metallica during the first Ork invasion of Armageddon. It may even be that all of the formation's Titans were wiped out in Mannerheim's last stand, and all that remained was support personnel in Skitarii forces organized into defensive battalions to protect the Legio's home bases. For the rest of Armageddon's defenders, the cost was no less dire. Out of the 20 or so Imperial Guard regiments and other planetary defense forces that had been placed along the rivers Diabolus and Stygius, only 5 managed to avoid the encirclement operation and withdraw to the Hive in Furnus. Of the remaining 15 regiments, several were destroyed either fully or partially in the withdrawal. The rest were trapped with their backs against the long, winding Palladius mountain range. Of that force, only 3 regiments managed to escape the Ork hordes barreling down upon them from behind. Total troop numbers estimate vary, but judging by the number of regiments along with the presence of other battalions, non-Steel Legion forces, and PDF troops, we can reasonably assume, and of course bearing in mind the fact that Imperial Guard regiments are far closer to what we in real life would refer to as divisions or even corps, and the fact that these are mechanized formations of varying size and specialization, infantry regiments, tanks regiments, etc., we can probably reckon somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000 troops. Although throwing in Skitarii forces, planetary defense forces, militia troops, and other such units, the number could be as high as 500,000, but for the purposes of this video we will be using the rough estimate of 250,000 to 300,000, since that would be the rough size of the 20 or so regiments of Steel Legion present at the time of the battle. Of these, some 50 to 60,000 odd were able to retreat to Hive and Furnace relatively unscathed. They only had to defend the river, and then of course the withdrawal itself, meaning that they were probably fairly intact, probably some total 40 to 50,000 making it back to Hive and Furnace. And as for the forces trapped against the Palladius Mountains, the circa equivalent of 3 regiments eventually made it across, so we're looking at something along the lines of 30 to perhaps 50,000 men, including the inevitable combat casualties that the crossing would have caused. We're probably looking at closer to 30 than 50. Leaving the total cost of this defensive action at somewhere around 150,000 men. Not to mention innumerable fighting vehicles, tanks, artillery, and other support weapons. The forces that made it across the Palladius mountain ranges would almost certainly only be carrying the bare necessities, since the roads in the area are virtually non-existent. The only fighting forces that had managed to withdraw in a relative good order were the regiments that headed directly for Hive and Furnace. Meaning that, in all due reality, out of a force of somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000 men, only somewhere along the lines of 40 to 50,000 were left combat effective at the end of 2 months of fighting. As for the Ork forces, absolutely nothing in the ways of reliable statistics exist. What we do know is that 3 Ork tribes were sent across the jungle and into Secundus. Now, as for what that means in numbers, we have absolutely no idea whatsoever. An Ork tribe can consist of everything from a few dozen individuals to a few dozen millions. What we do know is that the Orks were able to apply pressure to practically the entire Imperial's defensive line at the same time. And considering this was a defensive line stretching hundreds of kilometers, well, you can imagine the numbers for yourself. Their casualties must no doubt have been absolutely horrific. The Diabolus River is a nasty piece of work. It is essentially a heavily polluted river, running down from Hive and Furnace and into the sea. It is filled with all manners of chemicals that are less than entirely healthy to living tissue. And the Orks would have to cross this river of raging pollutants in the face of heavily defended Imperial Guard formations, artillery, tanks, chimeras, machine guns, positions, rockets, mortars, the works. No doubt their casualties stretched into the hundreds of thousands, but equally without doubt is that their numbers probably stretched into the millions to begin with. Which meant that while the Ork Horde could certainly absorb and afford these casualties, the Steel Legion could not. But for the true cost, we have to look slightly further into the future. The troops trapped against the mountains were doomed, and any attempt at a counterattack with the Legio Metallica had failed miserably. What now of the most exposed Hive and Furnace? The forces that were supposed to protect the Hive were practically all gone. The Hive had 5 battered regiments to defend it. Nowhere even remotely close to defend a Hive of that size. On 3 separate occasions, requests for aid had been sent and ignored. Soon, the Hive found itself surrounded by an innumerable Ork horde. Obviously, a Hive city is a formidable piece of fortification, and Infernus was no exception. But even the mightiest fortification in the world cannot be made effective without the men to crew it, and Infernus simply did not have the manpower. While there were billions of Imperial citizens available, there was no time to train them, and an untrained crew manning the fortress guns on a Hive is almost as much of a risk to the Hive as it is to the enemy. Faced with an impossible decision, the military commander of Hive and Furnace chose to surrender his Hive to the Orks, rather than see them all slaughtered in the streets. To call this a gamble would be an understatement. Luckily for the people of Furnace, if lucky is the right word, these orcs were commanded by one of Thraka's more intelligent leaders, and the people of Infernus was used as slave labour rather than playthings. Now don't get me wrong, the orcs are not the gentlest of slavers at the best of days, and hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, died. But at the end of the day, the Hive had virtually no chance of holding out during a siege, and certainly no hope of breaking it. And so, at the end of the day, the decision to surrender the Hive rather than resist the Orks probably saved billions. Meanwhile, in Armageddon Prime, the situation had deteriorated yet further. It was no longer a question of the Imperium simply withdrawing to the Hives. All of the Hives on Armageddon Prime were now under active Ork siege. The Overlord Hermann von Straub had relocated his command headquarters to Secundus, to Hive Tartarus. Luckily for the people of Armageddon Prime, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka had crossed over to Secundus, seeing the war on Prime as all but won. The population and the defenders had all been pushed back into their fortified Hive cities, cities that had not been prepared for a lengthy siege. Now, even during the worst of time, a Hive city has food stocks for a very long time. Considering the sheer size of the population, this is a simple necessity of life. Hive cities need to keep large stocks of foodstuffs and other basic necessities, because transportation of new foodstuffs, etc., cannot always be guaranteed. And if said transportation were to break down for even a week, a hive would be plunged into a nearly endless state of starvation and deprivation due to the sheer number of people inside. As such, there are always strategic reserves. However, these strategic reserves would obviously have to be increased massively to withstand a long-term siege. These reserves are designed to keep the Hive operational through short blockades or trade wars lasting months at tops, not years of grueling Ork siege. Nevertheless, the Hives were spared the immediate escalation and assaults that many of the Hives in Secundus were to be exposed to. And indeed, the situation on Secundus had been deteriorating rapidly ever since the Imperial defeat near the jungle. Hades' Hive, under the command of Commissar Yarrick, was now under siege by the Orks. Free from the meddling of von Straub, the Commissar had been able to preserve a considerable amount of real fighting troops, with which to man the considerable defences of Hades' Hive. Additionally, the Commissar had been hard at work preparing the Hive and organising the military as well as the civilian resistance. Hades' Hive had substantial strategic reserves of foodstuffs and other necessities to keep it going throughout a long siege. The good Commissar had also written up a doctrine of sorts that was distributed to all other hives willing to offer resistance to the Orks. One of the most interesting of these ideas was the mobilization of the so-called Hive Irregulars. These extremely improvised units were made up of hive gangers and other criminal elements of the lower and underhives. As you may reasonably expect, these were not the most disciplined of troops, or the most militarized for that matter, but at least in part they made up for this with real combat experience gained in the constant gang wars that plagued the hives and the cities at large. Granted, gang war experience is of limited use when it comes to full-scale open warfare against the Orks, but it is certainly better than nothing, and if nothing else, they would be fighting with the home field advantage. And as an added bonus, the Hive Gangers brought their own weapons. A great boon during this time of the siege, since proper arms and armour had to be distributed to troops that could be trusted to use them. The good Commissar also organised relief and resupply efforts to other besieged hives, distributing excess ammunitions, explosives and foodstuffs to the hives and Imperial forces under attack. Massive shipments of improvised explosives and mines were also dispatched to anyone willing to use them. We've already covered one example, but there were dozens of other situations where Imperial commanders, using the knowledge of ash-waste militias, would mine off vast areas of relatively stable ground, forcing the Orks to take lengthy and costly detours through the highly toxic environment of Armageddon, made even worse by the fact that the Orks had invaded Secundus during the time of fire. This was the period of the year where many of the volcanoes on Armageddon would start erupting, spreading vast clouds of ash all across the planet's surface, turning the already hostile environment even more dangerous. Not to mention, it meant that the Orks would have to rely almost entirely on supply shipments. Normally, Orks are able to live off the land, but with nothing to live off, seeing as all the vegetation was almost entirely choked off beneath a massive blanket of ash, and water was getting to be in short supply, even the Orks had to organize some basic and crude form of supply system, even if this supply system often just simply consisted of producing more Gretchens for the Orks to eat. Henrik also organized food supplies to be sent to besieged hives. These were conducted by shuttlecraft, carrying out extremely risky maneuvers right under the nose of Ork air superiority, to drop containers filled with standard-issue Imperial rations. Granted, most of the population would prefer to eat a nice tasty rat instead of Imperial Guard rations, but hey, if you're starving, even recycled shit will do, and no, that is not a metaphor. And Imperial Guard rations also had the added benefit of surviving even the most massive of drops. Considering that they are essentially just compacted protein bars, you could literally drop them from near orbit, and as long as you hit the hive, which granted is a pretty large target, it would survive relatively intact. One of the hives that received said aid was the port of Hellsreach. At this point, the main Ork thrust had reached Hades, and the siege of said hive was entering into its 5th week. Ork hordes had also begun their move from Infernus towards Acheron and Tartarus, leaving Hellsreach alone, with no hope of reinforcements. Having the advantage of being a major maritime trade hub, the Hive of Hellsreach had the luxury of trying to evacuate parts of the population to less threatened hives or outlying areas, specifically to minor settlements either to the north or the south of the tempestuous ocean. Evacuation was restricted to those under the age of 7 plus 1 Guardian, and those above the age of 90. And even then, there was nowhere near enough space for everyone. Each hopeful was given a number, and once the evacuation fleet was ready, numbers were chosen at random. Those who did not get picked or did not get to their allotted ship in time had their number turned into their militia identification and were officially enrolled into the Hive Defense Militia. Although with the supply situation being what it was, even calling them a militia seems generous. Poorly armed rabble might be more fitting, although even then their designation as armed didn't always hold true. Despite the frankly abysmal supply situation, there was one thing that Hellsreach had in abundance, and that was explosives. To be sure, a nice big bomb is a very effective weapon, but there are also few weapons that are less dangerous to an inexperienced user than massive amounts of TNT. Luckily, Hellsreach, just like Hades, had followed Yarrik's example and mobilized various Hive gangs into the defenses. The Hive gangers are often very fond of things that go boom, and in the Underhive, if you do not quickly develop a certain expertise for the explosive arts, you're not going to be alive for long. With the aid of the guards' demolition experts, civilians and gangers alike were set to work mining and rigging vast areas of the Hive and the outward defenses, in some cases even going so far as to prepare entire sections of the Hive to collapse. These efforts would later be codified and turned into official doctrine, as they proved to be extremely effective in inflicting casualties on Ork invaders. One of the accepted doctrines worked as follows. A hive spire, one of the smaller building blocks that eventually made up one large hive structure, would have several tiers of fortifications going upwards. Once the final tier, the rooftop, so to say, fortification was breached, one last surviving member of the defense forces would have in front of him a detonation device, and a small shrine to the Emperor. When the Orks were banging at his door, he was to detonate the explosives placed throughout the structure and collapse the entire goddamn thing. As you can probably imagine, with such a doctrine being commonplace, the civilian casualties were staggering. But the Orks were losing just as many, if not more. And it didn't stop there. The defences of Hellsreach Hive took on a downright fanatical aspect, as every single man, woman or child was thrown into the fighting. Those who didn't have weapons were set to lugging ammunition for those who did. Alternatively, they were set to hauling pieces of broken masonry, or large pieces of building material, or indeed anything else heavy onto rooftops, or up the sides of spires, so it could be thrown down onto the invaders. One harrowing account of the siege describes an old man who had just lost his children leap from a stack of containers on the docks with a hand grenade in each hand into a group of Orks below. Such acts of insane and suicidal heroism became the norm. The operators of the massive dock-loading cranes would weld themselves shut into their cranes and march out into the hordes of Orks to engage Gargants in hand-to-hand combat. The drivers of the massive loading trucks would pack their flatbeds with explosives and hurl themselves at top speed into the hordes of Orks to annihilate as many as possible in a vast explosion. For over a week, the Orks continued their assault, with some days seeing as many as 8 full-scale assaults upon the walls, with more to follow throughout the night. The Ork commander clearly had orders to capture the port immediately, otherwise such an aggressive and wasteful strategy would be seen as insanity, even when viewed through the crude lens of an Ork mind. After the horrendous casualties and massive damage inflicted to the Hive to the point that after the war it was considered to be a ruin for all practical purposes, the Hive was finally carried by the Orks, after 10 days of the most intense and bloody fighting of the war, after a massive Ork psychic attack that rendered practically all weapons in the Hive inoperable. Virtually the entire Hive's population were murdered, with a lucky handful being put to work. To the north, Hades' Hive was entering its 7th week of continuous siege. The efforts of Commissar Yarrick had so frustrated Ghazghul that the great beast of Armageddon himself went to Hades to stomp out the resistance of this unruly Yumi with the pointy hat. Commissar Yarrick's role in this heroic defense cannot be overestimated. His strategic and tactical leadership had kept the Hive in Imperial hands despite the direct attention of Ghazghul himself. And perhaps key to this effort, Yarrick knew the Ork mind like few humans ever have. And especially he understood how to take advantage of the Ork mentality and their habit of attributing success or failure to the nebulous acts of gods and fate. And Commissar Yarrick's road to becoming something along the lines of a deity amongst the Orks started with the very first attack upon Hive Hades. At this point, the defenders had yet to be fully mobilized and organized. It was at this point that a particularly brutal Ork assault was launched on Hades' Hive. The surprise was almost complete, and to make matters worse, the Ork attack was led by a particularly vicious Ork warlord. The defenses were set to collapse. Commissar Yarrick led a counterattack personally, and faced down the Ork warlord in single combat. It was at this point, after a protracted duel, that the Ork warlord closed his massive mechanical claw along Commissar Yarrick's right arm. And with a sickening crunch of bone and hydraulics wheezing, the Commissar arm was snapped clean off. Blood fountained from the mortal wound, but instead of falling over like any puny human would, the Commissar calmly and almost gracefully slashed out with his chainsword, catching the Ork war boss in the throat, almost completely severing the war boss's head. The war boss's corpse stood in shocked silence for a moment before crashing to the ground. But even then, the hero of Armageddon did not allow himself to pass out. He bent down and, using his chainsword, cut the massive orc claw from the warlord's arm and held it up above his head in triumph. If the orcs had been physically capable of pissing themselves in fright, they would have at this very moment. This one act of immeasurable bravery and incredible toughness broke the Ork assault and sent them fleeing before the guns of the Steel Legion. And only then did Commissar Henrik allow himself to pass out and be carried back into the hive and receive medical attention. It was at this point that Commissar Henrik insisted that the Ork claw be modified and grafted to his stump. For he understood that from this day forward, Henrik's claw would strike fear into the heart of all greenskins. And when the Commissar heard that the Orks were saying that the Commissar had the evil eye, he had his natural eye put out and a laser weapon put in its place. And while it is hard to quantify the value of the psychological impact of Henrik's reputation upon the defense of Hades' hive, it is no doubt whatsoever that it was not inconsequential during the weeks of fighting that was yet to come. Further to the southwest, Acheron Hive had been under direct attack for several weeks, but with the Orks in complete control over the surrounding countryside and indeed most of Armageddon, the Hive had been suffering from an indirect siege for months. Food and water had all but run out, and what little was left was all spent after a few days of Ork attacks. Like so many other hives, Acheron was critically short of soldiers and trained personnel. The troops that were supposed to protect the hives had, as in so many other cases, been sacrificed on the altar of von Straub's ego, leaving much of the hive's formidable defences silent in the face of the Ork horde. The citizens of Acheron did not have a Commissar Henrik, and the forces that were meant to protect them had been trapped and destroyed against the Palladius Mountains. What remained to Hive Acheron was a small gathering of professional troops organized into several scratch companies. Mostly these were the survivors of the disastrous battles around the Palladius mountain ranges, and a handful of regiments that had been able to either withdraw early or had ignored von Straub's orders. Most of these troops, however, were without their heavy equipment. Additionally, the Hive had access to some formations of Hive militia and other PDF troops. These were mostly relatively substandard troops, but at the very least they could be relied upon to hold a defensive line. And finally, the Hive could also call upon a decent number of Hive Ganger regiments that had been organized along the lines suggested by Commissar Henrik. These troops were most definitively not someone you would be relying on to hold any sort of defensive positions, but once herded into the lower underhives and attacked by waves upon waves of orcs, they would fight just as well as anyone else to defend their homes. Despite all of this, however, the Hive was in a hopeless situation. They did not have access to the surpluses of explosives that Hive Hellsreach had. They did not have Commissar Henrik, and they did not have a substantial garrison to defend them. And while they were not the center of the Orks' attention, the forces arrayed against them were more than enough to overwhelm Acheron in its weakened state. And despite valiant resistance from the scratch companies, the local militia, and indeed even the Hive Gangers, the innumerable Ork horde on their doorsteps would not be denied. The end was coming to Acheron Hive, and the Orks knew it. They had gathered in their hundreds of thousands outside the hive in the early morning of the final day of the Ork attack on Acheron. The last ragged, battered, and bloody defenders were stood upon their ruined walls, much like the defenders of Hive Hellsreach had done before them. When the last attack started, most of the defenders simply stood there. Some pitiful few fired their weapons into the advancing horde, and maybe half a dozen batteries still had some reserves of shell left, but to put it bluntly, the efforts of the defenders at this point was like pissing into a hurricane. It only emboldened the advancing horde. For the cities of Acheron, the day was at its darkest. But even in the darkest of days, the Emperor protects. And on this day, he sent his angels to the people of Acheron. The first the beleaguered defenders knew of their salvation was the appearance of hundreds of fiery contrails commeting down from the heavens. The fastest falling of these resolved themselves into the blocky brute shapes of Thunderhawk gunships, who dived down on the hordes below, unleashing a torrent of firepower directly into the advancing orcs. And straight down into these ragged holes torn in the orc formations, the gunships landed with bone-jarring force, and within seconds of these controlled crash landings, squads of Adeptus Astartes were streaming out of the Thunderhawk gunships, clearing larger spaces for the heavier elements of the spear tip that was already on its way. At the other end of the field, dozens more fiery trails were hammering into the Ork rear lines and main base camp. Deathwind drop pods cleared landing zones by expending thousands of rounds of ammunition in mere seconds, before further drop pods hammered into the ground, disgorging their even deadlier cargo of Blood Angels assault squads. And from one of the first transport pods to slam into the ground emerged a golden figure. Leading his sanguinary guard, Lord Commander Dante himself had come to Armageddon to claim the head of the beast. Unsurprisingly, the Orks were not expecting this. They had an absolutely minimal presence in orbit, and nothing that could even so much as slow the encroaching Adeptus Astartes fleet. Whatever assets they had in orbit were obliterated long before they could send any warning to the forces below, and the Ork horde was thrown into complete disarray by this sudden and vicious attack. And seeing their saviors in the flesh, the people of Acheron stormed out of their defenses and trapped the Orks between the defenders of Armageddon and the Emperor's avenging angels. The battle continued until nightfall, but when the sun rose once more upon the blasted landscape, the Ork horde, once numbering in the millions, had been utterly eradicated. Acheron Hive had been saved, and reinforcements had arrived. Blood Angels, Salamanders, and Ultramarines. But it was too early to celebrate just yet. Hades' Hive was still besieged and entering its 24th consecutive week of near-constant Ork attacks. If the symbol of Armageddon's resistance was to be saved, it would have to be saved soon. Meanwhile, Hades' Hive had so far withstood everything Thraka could throw at it, and he had thrown a lot. He had attempted to airdrop commandos onto the spire tops, a maneuver only an Ork could possibly survive. These commandos were eventually hunted down and killed in their purchase and hunting places, though they had already inflicted considerable damage on the Hive's command structure. Once this highly creative strategy failed, the beast had several gargants converted into massive earth movers that attempted to build ramps directly onto the walls of Hades. These efforts were to be supported by dozens of other gargants, along with specially constructed wall breakers. But before the massive siege engines could be put into motion, the gargants and the guns were destroyed by suicidal midnight counterattacks where Hive militia members quite literally climbed onto the massive siege engines and detonated dozens of kilos of explosives strapped to their very own bodies. For every move made by the Ork warlord, Henrik had a counter ready. It would not be unfair to refer to the Battle of Hades as a personal duel between the Beast and the Commissar. Heroic resistance notwithstanding, however, the brutal arithmetic of war was heavily stacked against the latter. It eventually became clear that the only move that remained to avoid complete destruction was a desperate breakout action. The Hive had ran out of food, the stream of supplies that had been coming out of Hades had now turned around to supply Hades. But supplying an entire hive from the air is like pissing into the Atlantic Ocean. Futile and utterly pointless. Hades was one of very few hives that had reacted in time to the Ork invasion to stock up supplies, arms, and munitions, but with scarcely a month to prepare, there is only so much that can be done to feed billions of people. In a daring series of shuttle runs, Yarick and top command personnel, along with a lucky few, were evacuated from the hive hours before it fell. Resistance would continue in isolated cells until the hive was retaken by the Imperial spearhead driving in from Acheron. But for all intents and purposes, the battle for Hades was over. Ghazghul Mag Uruk Thraka had claimed victory in a battle, but that very same battle had quite literally cost him the war. The Ork hordes had battered themselves to pieces upon the walls of Hades, and Ghazghul Mag Uruk Thraka himself had not been able to deal with the human with the pointy hat. But what about the Astartes relief force? Ultramarines and Salamanders continued the push towards Hades, along with any Armageddon Steel Legion forces that could still be mobilized and moved to keep up with the Astartes, which is no mean feat. But the most mobile elements of the strike force, the Blood Angels, had been ordered back into orbit by Commander Dante, to be redeployed in another lightning strike against the Ork forces threatening Hive Tartarus. This hive was the last of the hives on Secundus to be placed under siege, and was well defended on account of it being the new headquarters of the Overlord Hermann von Straub, after his ignoble flight from Armageddon Prime. Tartarus was expected to be able to hold out for weeks and probably months, as the primary limiting factor on Armageddon was supplies. Normally, a hive city can hold out hermetically sealed for years, but that requires the hive to be prepared for a lengthy siege, which was the very scenario that the Overlord had denounced as an impossibility. Nevertheless, being the last hive put under siege, it should have had plenty of time to react and adapt to the rather inevitable situation that was barreling down upon them. As such, Tartarus should have been able to hold out for much, much longer than most of the hives on Armageddon. It should in fact be on equal footing with Hive Hades, and possibly even better off, considering that it was the last hive to be put under siege, and would have had a longer period of time to gather up survivors of the Armageddon Steel Legion. So what had happened? How could the situation have deteriorated so quickly that Commander Dante saw no other solution than to withdraw his Blood Angels from outside of Acheron and bring them back aboard their ships in preparations for another deep strike operation against Hive Tartarus? And mind you, this is no small task. First and foremost, all of the forces, including drop pods, Thunderhawks, and armored vehicles deployed against Acheron, now had to be brought back into orbit. That alone was an operation that would normally take days. Then all of the forces need to be rearmed, re-equipped, and repurposed, and a new deep strike operation would have to be planned. And of course, there's also the simple fact that while a deep strike operations can be utterly devastating to an enemy formation, it is also a huge risk to take. The Adeptus Astartes forces will not be able to withdraw the same way they came down, and should the operation turn sour, the only exit strategy for the Astartes would be to fight their way out of an Ork horde, a less than enviable situation. Well, the deteriorating situation at Hive Tartarus could be ascribed to the same source as so many other catastrophes that had taken place on Armageddon during the invasion: the Overlord Hermann von Straub. And upon the arrival of the Astartes forces, it did not take Commander Dante long to take overall command of the war, and it took him much less time to identify the root cause of Armageddon's astonishingly quick fall: the idiot overlord. And so he had issued an arrest order for von Straub. He was charged with over 30 billion counts of grievous murder, along with a laundry list of other charges, including 112,992 counts of dereliction of duty, 221 counts of unholy insubordination, 22,398 counts of insurrection, and 2 counts of improper dress. The Overlord had, on his side, denounced the interference of the Adeptus Astartes, and claimed that he had matters well in hand. And unfortunately for the people of Tartarus, those were not completely empty words. The reason why the situation at Tartarus deteriorated so quickly was von Straub's ace in the hole. Von Straub had in his possession, stored away in the armories of Tartarus Hive, several virus warheads. These dreadful weapons containing the Life Eater virus had been placed on Armageddon after the events of the... what is this here? Angron, Chaos World Eaters... Okay. So, never mind that last part. You don't need to know how the warheads got on Armageddon. Trust me, it's for your own safety. All you need to know was that they were there, and they had been placed there in case of, well, bad things. The warheads were intended to not save Tartarus Hive from a siege, as von Straub intended on utilizing them. The warheads were there to wipe the planet clean, should it be necessary. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, the missiles had been in storage with insufficient, if any, maintenance for far too long. When the weapons were deployed from their armoured silos and fired at the Orks, the majority of the weapons didn't even leave their launchers, and several more corkscrewed wildly out of control. Nevertheless, these are weapons designed to kill planets, and even the few who made it into the Ork hordes caused catastrophic casualties, but luckily nowhere even remotely close to the damage that they could potentially have inflicted. Additionally, the virus had lost most of its potency over its long time in storage, and so a missile salvo designed to end the world merely inflicted uncountable casualties upon the Ork hordes. Unfortunately for the people of Tartarus, the Life Eater virus is a very fickle weapon, and it did not take long before it started making its way towards Hive Tartarus as well. When the virus finally began to dissipate, the Ork horde must have suffered casualties ranging into the hundreds of thousands at the very least, and possibly into the millions. But the defenders of Tartarus had suffered as well. And while the virtually numberless Ork hordes could at least to some extent soak up the casualties, Tartarus most definitively could not. The Hive's outer defenses were breached almost immediately, and the Orks began flooding into the Hive itself. And as previously mentioned, even with the supreme efficiency of the Astartes, it would take the Blood Angels days to recover from this full deep strike operation and prepare for another one. Meanwhile, the defenders of Tartarus that had survived von Straub's latest folly were fighting tooth and nail, sometimes quite literally, against an ever more desperate foe. At this point, the Orks had been made painfully aware of the shift in the times of war, and they were fighting not only to conquer, but to establish a foothold in Tartarus from which they might be able to hold off the Blood Angels and relaunch their offensive. And while the Astartes' strike upon the Orks outside of Akron was successful, it was not the shattering blow that had been delivered at Akron. The Orks knew what to expect now, and had prepared themselves accordingly. As such, the Blood Angels fell back on Plan B. The Blood Angels established a perimeter of constantly overlapping patrols of Blood Angels assault troops and armoured columns to separate the Orks attacking the Hive from the various tribes roaming Armageddon, the vast majority of which were at this point either heading towards Hades to reinforce the assault, or towards Tartarus to break into the Hive and establish that very same foothold. However, the Blood Angels proved to be more than able to keep up this blockade, and now that the defenders of Tartarus had real hope of being rescued, they fought on ever more fiercely. The Orks attacking the Hive now found themselves trapped between the defenders and the Blood Angels. By the time the Deep Strike assault had been launched, 33% of Tartarus' Hive had fallen to the Orks. But now that they no longer possessed the means to reinforce or resupply, the Orks were slowly being ground down. They could no longer push further into the Hive, and they even lost the ability to hold on to what they had already captured. But Orks do not give in to despair easily. It would take several more weeks of fighting for the last of the Orks to be rooted out. But in practicality, the fight for Armageddon Secundus was over after the Space Marines held out and linked up with the rapidly advancing relief force from Acheron. With this, the battle for Secundus was over. The Orks, who had so recently taken Hades, had little hope of actually holding onto the ruined Hive, of which very little was left standing. Its defences had practically all been smashed in the taking. And in a move that provided further evidence, if any was needed at this point, that Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka was not your average warboss, the Orks committed a most un-Orkish act. They began to withdraw. On Armageddon Prime, the situation was also resolving itself in the Imperium's favour. An Imperial army of squats, yes, the Space Dwarves, led by Inquisitor Horst, had landed around the same time as the Space Marines, and had begun to drive the smaller Ork forces on Prime into the equatorial jungle. The war would rage with full intensity for months yet, and would see one last great attack, led by Ghazghkull himself, with the aim of shattering the main Astartes' forces in a pitched battle. But with the Imperial forces concentrated and competently led, the much diminished Ork tribes were outmatched. The war was officially declared to be over after the remaining Orks were forced into the equatorial jungle. The beast of Armageddon was, however, not amongst the dead, and the new leaders of Armageddon began the great work of cataloguing and documenting the events of the war, so that if the beast should ever return, the people of Armageddon would be ready. The new Overlord also organized a massive xenocidal campaign to cleanse Armageddon of the Ork threat. The old saying, "Kill it with fire," was embraced with gusto across the planet, as all areas occupied by the Orks were scoured clean of greenskins, and equally importantly, their spores and fungus. The biggest problem was the equatorial jungle. Unlike the hives, the jungle could not simply be cleansed with fire. Even if the planet's rulers were willing to burn the whole jungle down, which would be a pretty bad idea as it was producing virtually all of Armageddon's oxygen, it's a pretty hard task to burn down an entire jungle, and it is even harder to find and brutally murder greenskins hiding inside of it. Nevertheless, efforts had to be made, and a specialized organization by the name of the Armageddon Ork Hunters were created to wipe out the remaining Orks in the jungle. This official goal was, however, quickly changed to an unofficial, but actually possible goal of containing the Orks and managing their population, so that they could never present a legitimate threat to Armageddon by themselves. This lack of effort in wiping out the Ork population was to prove costly at a later date. But for the moment, peace, of a sort, had returned to Armageddon. The root cause of Armageddon's near defeat had been dealt with, although von Straub himself had managed to escape and avoid his just sentencing. He would never wield power on Armageddon again. The root cause for the war, however, was still unaccounted for. And that has been my lore video on the first Ork invasion of Armageddon. I hope you've enjoyed it and the new custom artwork. And speaking of that, I would like to give a special thanks to all of my patrons, since they were the ones who made it possible for me to create all of this custom art. And I have also made it available to my patrons for download should they wish to use them as screensavers or anything else interesting. And if you're not a patron, well, give me all of your money, or alternatively, you're gonna have to print screen it, like we used to do in the good old days. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.